I didn't understand what they were saying, but the users did, right? Because it was in their terminology. They gave a standing ovation. It's like, now that is what we want, right?
Hello and welcome to the podcast. In the world that's changing all the time, design has such an important role to shape the future that we're going to be living in. Quite often we think about these small, exciting startups as being the ones going to come in and disrupt the game. And, that happens. I remember when Tesla started years ago, they were nothing. They were almost a joke. And now Tesla they're a major player. And major players probably have the most influence over our lives in that we can mythologize the idea of that startup industry coming in. But without the big players changing the way that they work and changing the way they interact with the communities around us, change is slow. And we've seen so many great things happen throughout the industry. And one of the great players that it's been a joy to work with over the last few years has been IBM. Now, we all know IBM as being computing technology and making fantastic software, but they've been pioneering how we think about design. They've been pioneering how we think about education in the world and what the mission of designers are. And for that, I'm incredibly excited to sit down tonight with Karel Vredenburg, who is the Director of Global Design Leadership, Culture, External Engagement, and Academic Programs at IBM. We're going to be talking about a whole load of topics tonight, centering more on the design education side, but we get into racial equality, we get into the vision of what is design, and it is a beautiful deep dive into what makes design fantastic. Now, I'll explain that we did have a few technical issues, so the sound quality does have a few glitches here and there, and that's because we're working in a pandemic across the entire world. We couldn't quite sit down between USA and the UK, but I hope that doesn't detract too much from the sound quality, and I hope that you do get to really enjoy it. So if it does glitch out, then please give it the time, because just re-listening myself to remind myself what we talked about and what we went into, I learnt so much more re-listening to it second time than I can remember first time round, and I know that in the future listeners I'm going to gain even more still. So it's been such a great investment of my time. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do, and I hope that this inspires you to think about how you can drive change in your organization or in your future career, what you can take forward and what you can do to make design every bit as powerful as it can be. Right now, you are the Director of IBM Global Design Leadership, Culture, External Engagement, and Academic Programs. What is that?
Yeah, so my role, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to your podcast. I'm super excited to talk to you about what I do and my views of design and UX as well. So yeah, my role is as a global director of design leadership, which means I have responsibility for the most senior design executives that are the heads of design each of the business units of the company. That's like 12 people. I also have responsibility for leading the about 140 senior design, that is managerial and technical leaders of the company. The 2,500 designers, and that's really the culture part that you mentioned. And then I also have responsibility for our sort of external engagement. That's our social channels and our dealing with the press and the events that we're doing and that sort of thing. And then I also have responsibility and have had responsibility for our academic programs, which involves working with sort of the top design schools and the top sort of universities, and also the historically Black colleges and universities in the United States, as well.
I've actually used some of the IBM training programs for design thinking and AI. I can tell you they are excellent. I've really enjoyed working through them.
Yeah, those had an interesting, genesis. I mean, we started the design program, and I should sort of set the context that, IBM was the first company, that ever had a global and corporate-wide design program in the middle 50s. And I wasn't around then, but that's sort of where it all started. And then we had a variety of design programs over time. I had actually led design for the last sort of more than 30 years at the company. But we had, I think, significant pockets of success in the past with regard to design. ThinkPad is a good example of that, which we then sold and don't have anymore. That's one brand that I wish that we had actually kept. But about 9 years ago, we got a new CEO that truly understood design and the need for design. Ginny Rometty was her name. She was just replaced by our new CEO, Arvind Krishna. But the perspective that Ginny had was that the IBM company was now experiencing major, changes in every market that it was in, every technology that it was in. When you think about, cloud and AI and mobile and security, you name it, they were all needing, quite frankly, a pivot. And even though it's a 109-year-old company, we needed to have some special ingredient to make that pivot happen. And so she gave our team the challenge to really come up with a sustainable transformation for the company, a sustainable culture of design and design thinking across the company. So we put together basically an overall new way of working. And it turned out that at the time that we were starting that, we had acquired another company, Lombardi Software, some 3 years before this. And Lombardi didn't have anything that was new technically or technology-wise. We actually had all the kind of technology they did. We had many, many products actually that did the same things that they did. But they just really put it together well. And the guy that led that company, Phil Gilbert, was the guy that basically took the design thinking that came from IDEO and the D School, so the double diamond sort of approach, and really put it into a more strong business and particularly large company focus. And so that we now call enterprise design thinking. But so we basically had the foundation of design thinking, or our version of design thinking called enterprise design thinking. We also figured that we needed to have a lot more designers. We had 230 designers prior to this. And then we decided we needed to have, maybe 1,000, 2,000 designers. And we took that to the board of directors, and they said, yeah, go for it. And so we've now at 2,500 designers across the company. We also wanted to focus on getting designers out of, cubicles. It's the fastest way to suck creativity and collaboration out of people, to put them in cubicles. So we basically created studios, and we've got some close to 100 studios around the globe doing that now. So that actually was the sort of the genesis also of while we were doing that hiring. In fact, I was in the UK. I was flying through basically, and I met with one of our teams that had been doing a full day of recruiting, and they said, "Hey, Karel, we got a problem." So we've interviewed 8 people, and we had a very rigorous way of saying what the hiring bar was. After the 8 people, none of those 8 met the bar for being hired. But we have 3 hiring chits, and it was at the end of the year. And should we, hire the best of the ones we've got, or should we just stick to our guns and say, you know what, they didn't meet the bar? And so I said, keep your bar high, and I'll make sure you keep your head count. And immediately after that, I met with the president of the UK Design Council, and we talked about this challenge. And then he and I also, right after that, had interviews with the press. And that led to a press article in the UK that had some headline like, IBM design director slams UK design schools for not producing good quality designers, or not enough of them, which wasn't really an accurate way of conveying what I talked about. But it did lead to a lot of interest from design schools saying, so what's the gap? What are we missing? And there were some fundamental gaps in the education work. I mean, things like the lack of multidisciplinary work. A lot of the time, designers are working with the design school definition of multidisciplinary meant UX and visual design and user research. That's not what we meant by multidisciplinary. We meant working with engineering, working with business and the like. So there's a bunch of gaps like that, and also working on real problems and the like, that we then stood up a boot camp, a 3-month boot camp that every designer that we hired directly into, right out of college, direct into our program, would go through in Austin, Texas. So we put them up for 3 months to go through that. And that was incredibly successful. But then we also realized, when we were talking about the online work, we also realized that that's not the only way we can change the way that people think and work, because we wanted to also change the mindset and the culture of how the whole company worked. So the experience that you had in doing the work online was our standing up of online education. That was like a 2-hour introduction to what design thinking is. And then that's a practitioner badge you get from that. And then we have a co-creator badge, which is something you do with a number of others and the like. And then there's a superstar category of design thinking mastery that we call the coach level. And so we implemented that, and way more than about half of the company is now certified in that version of design thinking. So that's where and when I talked about my academic programs, that's where my interest came from in working with design schools, because a lot of that discussion was how do we actually change that. That led to me doing my own teaching. So I basically did some prototyping of new curricula and the like. And that also has led more recently to working with Don Norman for a group that we founded that's called the Future of Design Education Initiative, which is actually trying now to do that right across the whole industry, so that we have for all sort of design schools and design taught in any university, a new set of curricula that we're working on, right now. We can dig in further on that, but that's sort of the lay of the land in terms of the transformation of the IBM company, and also the way that I got involved in the academic circles.
Now, I can speak from experience. One thing that's great about the co-creator badge you were talking about is most online courses, you can sleepwalk through some of them, and it's easy. Co-creator, if you don't get up and do it, you actually can't pass it. So you realize the value of how these really work really quickly. So I want to speak a bit more about that quality bar, about when IBM's hiring, you want these great designers. What makes a great designer for you?
It's a great question. I think that we've evolved that a bit over time, but we really wanted to have people that would not only have good craft, and this actually relates to even the future of design education work that we're talking about as well, that simply being a good craft designer, that's sort of like the base level, that's sort of the table stakes of what you need. But we're always looking for people that have the broader perspective on you're typically not just designing a thing, you're designing something that an individual uses and a bunch of other stakeholders are involved in and the like. And especially if you're doing enterprise design, which is what we work on, you need to have the broader sort of perspective on that. So it turns out that designers that have other discipline knowledge, that's also really beneficial. And so we often talk about, T-shaped people or T-shaped designers. And while you can have a superpower of being, let's say, a visual designer, and that craft really well, we also look for people that have a broader, vertical stroke of that T. So that would also have some UX skills, maybe some design research skills as well, and maybe even some front-end coding skills. and they go deep in terms of their superpower, but also have these broader experiences as well. And I think the other attribute that we look for is somebody that can be confident and can be can really carry forward their point of view, so that if they're working in circles that are more challenging, let's say, that they would have the confidence, not arrogance, but confidence to be able to express and really bring forward their particular design. And then also have made sure that you've actually done the additional work to make sure that you've got the validation for why this design is what it is, why it needs to be built the way it is, and the like. So that, and then simply being able to collaborate really, really well with other people. That's the kind of bar that we have.
So it's sounding like those soft interpersonal skills are as important as the theory book skill you might learn at university.
No, that's exactly right. And I think that a large part of even the future of design education work that we're doing now, and all the teaching that I do as well, I make sure that whatever course it is that I'm teaching, I make sure that it's a capstone or a project-based class. Students don't get to just make up whatever project they want to work on, because that always makes it so that, yes, you're practicing the methods and the like, but you're not really experiencing the real challenge that you're going to get in the real world. So I've been working with, as part of my academic programs, even providing projects to key schools. Like I work with the D School, for example, where we provide a project that is sort of enterprise level, so that school like the D School, which is an amazing program, but has almost always been focused on entrepreneurial focus, and startups and people that are going into NGOs and the like. And I wanted to also provide for their students the perspective of what working as a designer in a large company is all about. What kind of problems do we actually work on, and what's the experience of doing that? And I think it's been a real eye-opening experience there, as well as many of the other schools that we work with as well. So students that come out of that experience now know what a tough problem might look like in an enterprise. And realistically, even if they were then going to be doing a startup, they also will then realize the kind of tough problems you deal with there as well. So that, one of my favorite topics is to design so that you won't have unintended consequences. One of the biggest problems that I see in startups is this whole super positive attitude. We're going to change the world. This is going to be wonderful, but have you thought about there might be some bad actors that may do something that you're not intending with the program? And one of my favorite techniques that I now use all the time is called the pre-mortem. So if you're familiar with the design thinking methods, the pre-mortem is the one where you just at the point where you've just done some ideation, you've got some brilliant ideas, you're all pumped thinking this is going to be absolutely amazing. You basically imagine that it's a year in the future and you've implemented everything that you're thinking about doing, but that the project was an utter and complete failure. Not thinking, actually imagining that it failed. Why did it fail? Answer those questions. And then what mitigations can you put in now to prevent that failure? And everybody's always fond of talking about fail fast and often. Everybody loves that phrase. I always say, you know what? You should imagine your failure. And if you imagine it and you really give that serious thought and think about sort of what bad actors could do, or what a competitor might do, or some condition in the world, like maybe a pandemic, may change the way that you're actually thinking. If you're anticipating that, and especially right now, if anybody's wanting to do anything that is appropriately anticipating the future, we can't just design for the here and now. And so one of the other areas, in addition, that's kind of like the pre-mortem is like a baby step into foresighting, basically. And that's a whole other area that I think we need to be looking at as designers, to be able to not only design for the here and now, but to be able to anticipate future alternative sort of futures, and then actually have designs for them, so that it isn't the case that when the environment changes, the competitive environment, the social environment, whatever, that you've anticipated what's maybe not perfectly, but what sort of directions there could be. And once you've actually predicted those and you've got an idea of what kind of design you need to be able to do, then you'd be able to actually be, ahead of the game, as opposed to what happens today. You design for the here and now, and then we experience some unintended consequences because we didn't anticipate something. And then as a result, we can't actually, we have to actually start from scratch again and try to, come up with something new.
So if our current experience, the here and now, is the known, how can we effectively imagine that future unknown state? Because think like back in 2019, we couldn't have foreseen COVID. I mean, I was in Wuhan in December when it was kicking off, and you wouldn't know. So how can we imagine these future states?
Yeah, that's one in particular that was pretty unpredictable. But at the same time, if you think about, the early days when we did see what was happening, and you think about what every company and organization now needed to do. Okay, everybody's now working from home, and now you're thinking, okay, well, let's think about, and that's even the case right now. Think about, okay, what do the case rates look like? What's the rate of vaccination? What about these variants? So you have a bunch of those factors, being at play. You look at the trend in those directions and say, okay, what is the scenario? I teach a course to board directors, directors of companies, and this is what I teach them in terms of saying, okay, now think about what if this were to be the direction. Now the vaccinations go wonderfully well, and the variants aren't a factor, but you now are at a point where we don't have COVID-19 around anymore. That's one scenario. What would your solution be for that? If you're doing some, real estate piece of work or something that's relevant to that industry, let's say, that's one outcome. What if the other outcome is that we still end up working in work from home sort of environments for a long time, and there's real concern about going out, more? That's going to have a direct impact on now thinking about whatever solutions you're working on, whatever industries you're in. It's going to change that outcome, and so you need to think about what that experience would be like. I'm currently on the board of directors of a vegan organization, and it's an organization that runs a big food fair once a year for about 40,000 people attend it. Right, and right now we're not doing those. Right, so we're now doing, we're amping up heavily the digital side of things, and afterwards we're going to be able to do both. But right now we're having to look at the trends, a bunch of data to predict what's the likelihood that we're going to be able to do some hybrid event, a fully in-person event. All of those kinds of things are things that there's at least data that show a trend. You don't get perfect prediction, but you want to know what possible directions things would go. As another example, if I advise some startups, and one particular startup had a brilliant idea, and they were all super excited about it. And I said, but competitors can copy this really easily. What happens to this idea in a year from now, when one of the major other organizations that are already in the business, what if they simply add this as another feature to what you're doing? Can you make what you're developing either more sticky or something that won't be able to be replicated or copied as easily? It's that kind of thinking. And the other one in terms of anticipation in the future, the notion that if you were to come up with, let's say, a social network for connecting the world's people, and it's going to be wonderful because people are going to be able to share family photos and all of that kind of stuff. That's really, really cool. And then we're also going to advertise, and have a monetization strategy for advertising. And now you can also, let's say, customize your advertising to particular data that you've got about the users. What if now you want to have somebody, let's say it's another country that is trying to like influence an election, for example, now they don't have to do anything really unusual. They can actually use that advertising engine to say, these are the kind of people I want to micro target, with a message. Well, had you thought about that? Could you possibly have thought about that as a possible thing that somebody could use your platform for? Had you thought about, let's, for example, the pre-mortem, or thinking about what are things that people could do that could compromise your good intentions with regard to this overall system? So I think it's things like that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic method to be using, because whenever I speak to designers or work with my students or anyone in industry, they have this real celebration of, we got this idea, wow, let's just clap ourselves on the back, tell us how great it is. I very rarely see that negative side as being a positive to think about. Because things like, I don't think Facebook ever started out thinking, how can we let people use our advertising to control minds? Or how can we influence world politics? How can we make Brexit happen? And it did. So do you think that if everyone had this critical approach of what if, let's design for that now and prevent those consequences, would that have a positive impact on society, or is it just making designs work a bit better?
Yeah, I think it is a way to make society better. I mean, I actually argue that designers as a broader collection of people should realize the power in what they have the ability to do. I think, back maybe a couple of decades ago, design didn't really have much power. There was one instance, for example, where I had this one designer on my team who's a brilliant designer, but he was used to having a lot of pushback from engineers on his design. And he did a whiteboarding exercise with a team of engineers and had some ideas on the board. Came back the next week and said, "Well, I got some other ideas. I think it should be like this instead." And he had this big revolt on his hands because all the engineers in the room said they'd actually built everything that he had actually whiteboarded, right? Which was a unique experience for him. that there was that much power in design. But design now really does have significant power, but significant power to do good as well as evil or not good, right? And so I think when you only teach, and I think that's what comes back to the education again, I think we need to be able to teach what that power is like and how to control that power appropriately as well. And I think there may well also be a need for an overall sort of declaration of ethics. The architects have that, for example. That I know that there is a case that there's for-profit prisons in the United States that architects refuse to work on because they say that is against their professional ethics to do so, because the size of the cells, for example, is too small, for humans or whatever. They've got a bar that they set for themselves. And I think the design profession should do a similar thing, that just because your company wants you to do this and this and this because it'll increase the revenue for the company, I think there's a responsibility for designers to also step back and say, well, I'm not sure that that's actually going to be really good for the mental health of the users, because we're going to get them so addicted to working on this thing, they're going to do nothing else. They're going to be so immersed in it. So I think there is a need to have that kind of perspective, and I think that also has to start with design education.
Totally, because I remember a few years ago being in just a general meeting with my design team, and we're talking about gambling websites, like what would happen if someone offered you a job. And I was going, I couldn't do it. You're you're using all your powers to get money out of one person's pocket into another as fast as possible. I can't do that. And the rest of the team just went, they got loads of money, I'll do it. And you realize that there was this complete ethical divide. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, because gambling can have very positive things. We do it when playing the lottery with small stake. But there was no critical discussion of when is it right and when is it wrong.
Yeah, and that's what we need to introduce, I think, in design education. And that's one of the things we're doing this Future of Design Education initiative that we're running, is themes like that, to be able to make sure that designers in the future will be doing that analysis and to be able to think about that, the impact of what it is that they're doing. And also, quite frankly, as I mentioned earlier, not only to be focused on the craft, but to look at the bigger picture view of as well. And that these methods can be applied to, designing whole organizations. I mean, I think that we used design and a designer's mindset to design the transformation of the IBM company with design. It was truly thinking about where are the users, let's say the employees, and also the executive team, where are they at now? What do we need to introduce to get them to where we think they would want to be in terms of where they would want to be, and also where we want the organization to be? And then designing experiences, like, for example, when I talked about all that work that we did with the boot camps for designers, we also did the same for existing project teams. So they would fly down for a week of a boot camp. We'd have a couple of designers, a couple of engineers, a couple of business people, and they would work on their actual project using these design thinking methods and the like. And then they started using this. So that was another way of actually, changing their mindset about the way that they worked. And it was the entire team, not obviously just the designers. But then we also check back again, you gather feedback, right? So we gather feedback a few months down the road when these teams are off doing this now. And we were saying, how's it going? And they'd say, you know what? It's going great. We love this stuff. We're being way more effective. One of the lead architects that had been on a product for like 15 years said, you know what? I got more insight into my users and what we should be doing in a 15-minute exercise than my 15 years on this project. So they saw the incredible value in these methods, but they said, we still have one problem. And our problem is the executives above us. The executives above us are expecting to see a high fidelity prototype when we're spending our time trying to validate the problem and really understand the users. And so we realized we needed to the term we use, activate, is basically re-educate the executive team as well. Now, did they need to go do this stuff and be able to actually do actual design? No. But they needed to know, as executives, what they needed to do in their leadership toolkit. What did they need to rely on to be able to make sure that they enabled and supported their teams appropriately and doing design correctly and design thinking as well, but also to, what kind of questions should they ask? What kinds of things could they really ensure that the organizations were doing? And so we did that across the board. We started with our C-suite, so right from our CEO and her direct reports, all the way through all the other executives in the organization as well. So but that's using a designer's mind to redesign an organization, right? And then there's other instances at the beginning of the pandemic. Actually, it was about 4 months before the pandemic. I did a keynote at the Design for America Summit in Chicago, and I was basically making the case that I made a little while ago here, saying that designers should go beyond their responsibilities, even for just the company or the organization that pays their bills, pays their salaries. That we have a sort of moral responsibility as a design community to make the world a better place. And so I was making that case, and I said we should really be focusing on some wicked problems around the organization, around the world. And then the pandemic hit. And so we decided to put together, I got together with the Design for America organization, also with the World Design Organization, and then about 100 designers from IBM as well. There were about 255 designers that we pulled together that really worked on COVID-19 as a challenge. What could designers do to make a difference in trying to improve the lot of the world? And so we worked on a variety of how might we statements, everything from how might we try to inspire certain particular groups of people to practice appropriate safe behaviors, for example. So there's a whole campaign of Instagram visuals that were created that were, emotive or sort of try to inspire and people to do the right sort of behaviors. Everything through. We did some work on how to make remote education more effective through WhatsApp, for example. That was done in India, and even things like how could you make the experience of physicians and nurses that needed to go into the ICU that weren't used to working in the ICU. There was like a 17-page PDF they needed to read in order to know what to do and put on PPE properly and everything. And designers can make that more consumable. And so they basically worked on that problem as well. So there were 7 whole areas like that. We worked for 3 weeks, all remotely from home. And we have the results actually that are at COVID-19designchallenge.org. You can see the results of it there. I also wrote a Medium article about it as well. But the whole point was, and we took quotes from people that were involved in it, and there were people that were deans of design schools. There were people that headed up basically design agencies. We also had a bunch of students involved in it, and then a lot of these designers at IBM. Really, I think realizing the incredible power of these methods that we normally use to, create commercial products, for example, could be used to really make a difference in the world. And so I think that we need to, when we talked about we needed to, teach ethics and all that in design schools, we also need to make sure that we are, providing really tailored education for how could we design more than things, but designing organizations, designing, societies and the like as well.
That's a really excellent insight. And I think education is one thing that's coming up again and again with what we're talking about, that if you're starting right, it makes the next stages more powerful. So thinking back to when you were just starting out, maybe when you were 21 graduate, what do you wish someone had taught you?
Fascinating question, actually, Chris. I think that the major thing was that of really realizing that there isn't a single path for education, and that it isn't the case that you just get your education and then you're out in the world. That you really need to, continuously absorb more knowledge, get more practice at whatever it is that you're doing. I mean, I started off life as a musician. That was really what my intended career was going to be. I then realized that when I talked to the students that were in the university I was thinking of going to for a Bachelor of Music program, and they said, we spend all day in little tiny practice rooms, and we're going to be doing that for 4 years. And I said, maybe I don't want to do that. And so I'd actually then went into psychology as an undergraduate. Then I did clinical psychology, and that was now going to be my path. And I was going to be a clinician, basically doing clinical psychology. I did that in some jails and in some psychiatric hospitals and the like. And then I was working on my PhD, and I was doing work on information processing, basically cognitive and affective reactions to information. And I was running a bunch of experiments, and they were all technology mediated. They were all experiments that were run on a computer. So you had to use that equipment. And this was like, more than 30 years ago. And I was noticing that even though I was advertising for getting research assistants to do that work, I had a really weird phenomenon in that only men applied, even though at the university I was at, University of Toronto, about 60% of the students were women. I said, so that's weird. There was this phenomenon at the time of there being a gender difference in using using computers. And so that's interesting. I want to dig into that. So it looked at, advertising, and did it have an effect? Yeah, it did. Early childhood sort of education, looked at how boys and girls interacted, in schools. These were all in addition to my dissertation, by the way. And so then I did some 9 different studies on that, and then ended up doing a lot of work on actual user interfaces. And so I pivoted into design and basically looked at what kinds of attributes, from a research point of view, what kind of attributes could we really be pulling into UIs, and then actually looking at self-report results, but also looking at galvanic skin response and heart rate. So really looking at enjoyment as well as anxiety, and found some really great differences that you could make in the UIs. And so I presented that at an academic conference, and that got into the press. And so I was interviewed on the radio and television at the time. And somebody at IBM said, have you ever considered working for IBM? And I said, actually, no. But I'd read a book about the founder about a year before that, and all the values the IBM company had. So I said, okay, I'll go for the interview. Went for the interview. We started talking about salary and the kind of setup I would have there. And I said, I'll give it a year. And that literally has been 33 years. So I think one of the things that, I mentor a lot of people, and I've also got a podcast series as well that came out of my mentoring of a lot of people. And it was really to share those kinds of insights. So the experience of you don't need to just choose the one thing that you're going to do. You're going to need to probably have a circuitous route. And some of the people that are the most effective, I find, are people that, worked their way through a number of different disciplines, or certainly broadening their own discipline. So I think, the big insight, I wish that I'd known then, but I think I also probably would have done the same thing still in terms of my career, is to actually navigate it through and really found the things that I have passion for and about, and really then pursuing them, deeply.
I can totally attest to that. Like when I first went to university, I arrived on my design course, and confession, I didn't like it. And I went, no, I want to do music. And I applied to transfer to the music production course. The only reason I didn't do it is they were full. And you can't actually see behind me, and it's radio. You can't hear anything, but there's about 5 or 6 guitars, lead pools, and Strats behind me. So music's still a massive passion, but from design through to what the hell to do? Lighting design and all these various pieces. And I still end up basically as a overqualified scientist. And back when I was 18 at school, we did this psychometric testing. What did they say I should be? Scientist. So I ended up exactly where they said it should be, but in a really bizarre route. But,
I think that's an interesting story. And I think it's the case that we all have serendipitous things that happen, to us. I mean, when I was getting the idea that I didn't want to do music anymore, I was doing both popular music, had a band on the weekends and stuff, but I also did classical music. And so I was at a classical concert, and there was this soloist there. It was just phenomenal, and I thought, well, maybe I do need to go back into maybe this is a mistake not to go into music. So I talked to the guy afterwards, and turned out he was a dentist. So I thought, what, that was his primary, role, and then music was his avocation. So that's made my mind up for me to say, you know what, I want to make music and a bunch of other things my avocation, but I'll go down this path of that I did go through. And I think there is a realization as well. So Don Norman, that I work with, who's fairly well known in the design field, also has gone through several disciplines as well, right? Started off in electrical engineering, for example. And I've talked about as well that a lot of the leaders of companies and design organizations have that kind of pedigree, have that kind of history, that it's a variety or a varied path rather. And even Phil Gilbert, my manager at IBM, that sort of brought our our whole design direction that we've been working on at IBM for the last 9 years together. He also has that same background as well, and I think there's a sense that if you have a variety of different experiences and educational backgrounds, you see the world, I think, somewhat more comprehensively. And I think that's a real advantage. I've been looking lately at the design education experience. And one of the things that we're looking at in this future of design education work as well, and I've been looking at IBM as well, is that, what's the comparison of students that come straight out of a 4-year design school to students that are coming through a university design program that is more varied in terms of its discipline mix, and then also even to the boot camp programs, right? The short cycle of UX education. And I've been going back to asking questions of the managers of employees that we hired that came through a boot camp program, and I get feedback like there's one guy in particular that's just being really, really successful, and he went through a General Assembly boot camp program in the United States, but he also has a bachelor's and master's degree in law as well. And what's really interesting is the feedback I get. He's got a broader perspective. Like it just has that. So I think that we need to go do that more. And so if there's a lesson in, if there's anyone listening that is early in their career or still, in college or university, is to broaden your perspective. Take some more of those electives in other programs and and then and because you'll have a broader perspective on the world.
And that's one of the main differences between mainly US education and UK. I believe in the US you have lots of these electives and you can go a bit crazy, whereas the UK it's pretty straight and narrow that you might have a choice, but it's between two things. But we're talking a lot about the processes and ways of working. You mentioned earlier enterprise design thinking as IBM's version of design thinking with the slight changes. Could you explain what enterprise design thinking is?
Yeah, I can. I think that it's also the case that the approach that predated it, that I brought into IBM, that was also based on work that Don Norman did. It was called user-centered design. I have a book on it as well. And what was missing in that? We would do things like task analysis, but we would only look at sort of the efficiency of tasks that you'd want to carry out. What does design thinking, bring to that? Well, it looks at what I like to call the 360-degree view of the user. That is, if you're properly doing user research. So our enterprise design thinking bolts in basically or enables the foundation of user-centered design. So things like doing really deep user research, making sure that you're actually doing ethnographic observation or structured interviewing or whatever it is that you're going to be using, contextual inquiry, and then capturing that in the design thinking sort of mapping methods because that's actually a brilliant way of very quickly capturing what is there. So one aspect of enterprise design thinking is that we don't differentiate between sort of the mapping methods of design thinking and see it as a separate thing that you need to be doing with regard to doing user research, for example, or user feedback. That's directly integrated in it. And in fact, I just wrote a blog post with the title of Innovation Theater versus Design Thinking Mastery. And a lot of people are practicing innovation theater. So they're only using the design thinking mapping methods or workshopping methods, for example. They don't do any user research to inform it. So you're basically flying blind. You don't actually know who it is that you're actually doing anything for. You're doing all the various methods. You're also not building anything. You're not making anything. So we have a concept in enterprise design thinking of the loop. You need to observe, and then you reflect largely with the mapping methods, and then you need to make. And then you go through this loop many, many, many times. So our focus is truly super integration and of those methods, and also iteration. And then we've also got a number of other features, like a focus on three other core elements. So we have this concept of a hill. A hill, it comes from the which I'm not that fond of in terms of military analogies, but it comes from sort of the military commander's intent, that a commander tells some troops to be able to go take that hill. They don't go down to the details of, if you encounter this, you do this. If you encounter this, no, you're empowered to go take that hill. And so a hill statement is basically who is going to be able to do what with what wow experience. So that's sort of the fundamentals. So the who is the user. Be really specific about who it is that you're going to be serving. What are they going to be able to now experience with what it is that you're going to be building in their terminology, in something they would understand, not in marketing speak, right? And then really importantly, the wow. What are they going to be absolutely blown away by about this new capability that you're going to give them, to the point where they're going to go jump on social media and say, you know what, this product I just used is just amazing. This and this is absolutely amazing about it. So that's the notion of hills. And so rather than using requirements or backlog lists of tasks you need to go to, all that's still important. But we also focus on what that intended outcome for the user is going to be for the project. And we get teams to create 3 and only 3 of those for a particular product release, for example. And we had this interesting experience that a large project of ours several years ago, where the product managers for that group were speaking to a large group of users of that product, and talking about the new release for it. And it was a really technical thing. And there's like 100,000 people in the audience or whatever. And they simply stated the 3 hills that those users were going to be able to now get with this next release in their terminology, including the wow. And I didn't understand what they were saying, but the users did, right? Because it was in their terminology. They gave a standing ovation. It's like, now that is what we want, right? As opposed to, here's this, 530, requirements or backlog tasks. So that's another one. Another one is really making sure that we have a focus on playing back designs. So we have feature presentations in agile methods, for example, but that's where you're, now it can do this, and hey, look, you can now do this. What we do with playback is playing back to the users, but also to the key stakeholders. So including, the marketing team, the engineering team, the design team, the evolving experience of the user in terms of and right from the earliest stages, when you're just kind of concepting, what this thing's going to be, what might this look like? And it might be just drawings at the time, right? All the way through to actually shipping it, where you're constantly focused on now that user experience and not any of the intermediate ways of actually characterizing what it is that we're doing. And then making sure that we're also working on what we call sponsor users, so that we are, rather than necessarily have hundreds of users that you might send surveys to, you could still do that if you wanted to. But the real benefit, we argue, is, and I like to say, you'd be able to stare into the whites of the eyes of your users, and just a few representative of your target market, but some 4 or 5 of them that every week you're going to work with to the tune of about 2 to 3 hours. If you're doing that, and you're doing these other things we're talking about, and so those are the kinds of things that we think really makes a difference.
And obviously, there's a lot more to go into enterprise design thinking than we could probably get over a whole podcast episode. So if people listening want to go out and read more about this and find about all the techniques that you guys have pioneered, where can they go?
They can go to ibm.com/design. That's our general design site. Which also, by the way, has a new feature in there as well that's worth looking at, which is called Racial Equity in Design. So we have a major focus right now on that, making sure that we, as a company itself, and not only the US part of the company, the worldwide company has a particular focus on diversity and various particular aspects of diversity, and also even, decolonizing design, really making sure that we incorporate the influences of a variety of different cultures, and the Black culture is an important one. The indigenous cultures are also really informative in terms of that. So that whole effort we've been doing inside the company now for intensely for about 6 months. But we also just made that material available externally as well. So things like how to have difficult conversations about race, for example. So there's a bunch of materials there you can download, use. There's a podcast as well that we're doing that's called It's About Time. But then getting back to the design thinking work, it's basically ibm.com/design/thinking will get you directly to our design thinking work. And the online education material right now is also still free. We made it all free during COVID, and we'll decide where we're going to take that. But right now, all of that stuff is free as well.
It's great to hear that IBM's really on the diversity issue, because, oh God, I've stopped looking at the news from how scary it is. And look at things like the other day, an old Asian woman in America was attacked, and she put the guy in hospital, which is good karma. But you look at this and go, how? Say, okay, she's from a different ethnic background. Okay, great. We're done with that now. Let's go and solve world hunger. It's like, I personally can't understand why these issues are still issues. But obviously, they really, really are. They need addressing. Technology is a bit of a strange one, because everyone might assume, well, it's a ThinkPad. It's some software that does this. It's it's SPSS that does that. That's just software. What role do you think IBM could play in increasing diversity outside of talking about it?
I think that we as designers at IBM and right around the whole globe, the point that I made earlier, can make a big difference in this stuff. So I share your same shock that we still are where we are in societies in terms of these topics. And I truly, firmly believe that we need to, do something about this. And I think we have the skills to be able to do it. So one area is that I talked about the design challenge that I ran last year with the World Design Organization and Design for America. We're going to do that again. We're just planning it for this year. And the topics of this year will be things like truly making a difference in climate change. Also, a real focus on preventing future pandemics, not just dealing with them, but preventing them. A focus too on racial equity. On divisiveness in society and the like. And so really trying to, when you think about the power that we've got as designers, we can design systems. We also, if the advertising business is as successful as it is, because we are changing people's points of view and thinking and actually changing behavior to go and buy a particular product. And a lot of that is done with design. Right? If we use that same power of design to address the kinds of inequities or the kinds of biases that people have and the like, I'm firmly of the view that we can make a difference in that. Can we change everybody? No, but can we make a big difference in society by doing this? Absolutely. And on the racial equity side of it itself, one of the things that we're doing at IBM is transforming ourselves first. So we've been really focused on that. So my leadership of the design leadership community, we're massively focusing on how do we more effectively, especially what we use the terminology of first pillar and second pillar. So first pillar is our Black colleagues, and second pillar is white people like myself, and that we want to make changes in the company and beyond the company, but we realize that that shouldn't be with all the heavy lifting having to come from our Black colleagues, right? They have the experience, the lived experience that we can learn from. And I think we, as second pillar, need to deeply, really, draft into understanding more deeply, what our privilege has been and the way that we actually need to go change the way we work. We need to take that lead from our first pillar, Black colleagues, and then together with them really make changes. And we're doing that inside the company. We're also now, like I said, sharing that, external to the company. We're also now, when I go back to education again, also helping to develop curricula basically for, design schools in general, but also really trying to incorporate, as I was saying earlier, multiple influences on design now, like racial influences and the like. And we're also developing curricula for and are actually teaching at the historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. So I have focals assigned to the top design schools around the company, the universities, and also the historically Black colleges and universities. And we basically do programming at those schools. So we're just standing up a new course that we're going to be teaching this summer to sort of all the historically Black colleges and universities to really make design an option and make students from various disciplines realize what they could do if they came and became designers, and not only at IBM, but that's part of our reason. We want to actually invite and then hire more Black designers to really address even the imbalance of Black designers versus white designers in the industry, and also in our company. Our company is slightly better than the industry as a whole, but we also know that we have a lot more work to be done. But the work that we're doing isn't only just for ourselves. Our intention is really to give back, and rather than just throwing money at schools, our belief, and my personal belief, is we want to work collaboratively and actually changing the perspective, and also providing additional opportunities there as well. So I think there's lots to be done, but I as I keep on saying, I think designers have an amazing power to make changes, and I think that we're not living by our own sort of the moral objective that I think that we all have to actually make a difference in the world, and not only just pull a salary doing design in the companies we work for.
I really love the way you think about first pillar and second pillar as it's about those unknown unknowns, in that you look at what we're doing in Loughborough. There's very few Black staff and students in our roster, and that's not because we're not trying. It's that we've traditionally put people like myself in charge of recruitment, and they've done a great job at lots of things, and we're getting better. But how on earth can me, a very posh sounding white guy who's never had to deal with prejudice, or when I look at the industry, like something about Don Norman mentioning, I've got his book somewhere to the side. I look at Don Norman, I can see myself at some level. I look at you, I can see myself at some level. I've never had to grow up with looking at industry going, no one is like me. No one's from my background. So, we've definitely got to learn from that. And one of the things that we're doing is partnering with the Kamoyo Fellowship in Nigeria. And we're getting their students to work with our students on design projects, so that our students have increased diversity into another culture completely, to really get that empathy and really understand. But I could talk for hours about that, but I think you're far more interesting to speak to. But we're getting to the end of our session at the moment. So I was wondering, out of all you've achieved and of all you're working on, what are you the most proud of?
I think really proud of several things. One is the transformation of the IBM company, given the fact that I have had a leadership role in the company for some 3 decades. And as I said earlier, we had some successes over the early years, but I honestly never thought that we would be able to accomplish the transformation that we've actually accomplished. So I think that itself, and having had a hand in doing that together with my colleagues, I think is really a success. I think the effort too of, focusing on this, trying to change the way the world works. I mean, I always have these, some will argue are arrogant sorts of views, but I really think that we have an opportunity to dramatically change. So, for example, design education, that we can actually make a difference there, that we can not only make a difference in design education, but it'll also, as a result, have a significant impact on the world and improving, the world. And the other part of it that I'm proud of and I'm working on as well, that is an aspect of that, is that I am an animal rights based vegan, and I want to change the world and wanting to basically do plant-based sort of solutions. And so my family is heavily in that as well. We are all ethical vegans, and they all are, and I'm proud of them for that. Whatever the roles they're playing, they're also in their disciplines really making a difference and trying to make the world a better place. And so I think if we all had that sort of perspective, the world wouldn't be in the kind of shape it's in. I think there's really an opportunity to make a significant difference in the world. And I feel best when I can help, even in small ways, of making the experience that anyone has, but also what all larger groups of people are having, to really make an impact on the way the world works.
And that's a really beautiful way to finish today. So, Karel, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
It's a great pleasure being interviewed by you, and also I think your overall podcast series is fascinating. So I thank you for the invitation. And anybody that wants to follow up further, my website is karelvredenburg.com, which is basically KarelVredenburg.com. I know that's a mouthful, but once you've keyed it in, you can find it. Or you can just Google me. You'll find, my relevant online presence there. But thanks so much for the invitation.